Well, let's get some analysis now with Ben Aris. He's the editor-in-chief at BNE IntelliNews and joins us live from Berlin. Ben, always good to speak to you. So we know that this meeting is going to take place, but the question everyone wants to know is where could it be? Because both leaders and countries would be very particular about the location, won't they?
Yes, that's always a difficult question. If we go back to 2001, there was a meeting between Biden and Putin just after Biden came into office, and that was held in Geneva. That's a classic venue. One of the Scandinavian countries like Oslo, that's another classic venue. In more recent times, during this war, that it's been Turkey that's been the favored option. And Erdogan, Turkish president, he's basically friends with both sides and a facilitator in this. So I think that's a very highly likely option for hosting this conference.
And of course, there have been other meetings being held here in Istanbul between those two sides. But could this meeting between the leaders in particular be a way for Putin and Trump to make real progress on Ukraine? Or is this just another way of Putin being able to appease Trump in some way?
Well, there's an element of that. It begins with appeasing that he needs to keep Trump on board. And then there's the threat of new sanctions, which, of course, the Russians are not pleased about. But if we look behind that at the underlying motives, the Russians have said repeatedly that they're actually not scared of sanctions. It's not really a threat because of the 30,000, an extreme regime that's been put on since the last 3 years. It hasn't really worked. In so much as it hasn't brought the Russian economy to its feet. And I think you have to understand Putin's motivation here is two things. He's worried about security, and in that he wants to make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO. It's a national security issue for him, missiles on his border. And the second thing is that he actually wants the sanction regime lifted. And in that sense, Trump is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have sanctions lifted. Because if it's not done with Trump, I think whoever takes over the next US administration is going to go back to the way it was, and sanctions typically stay on for a generation. And that's why we're having this meeting, that Putin doesn't want to burn his bridges with Trump, and that in the early stages of the ceasefire conversation that started in Riyadh in February, that Trump was actually pushing the concessions that Putin was asking for. He was pushing for lots of sanctions relief. And Zelensky refused, European partners refused. But now they're going to have another face-to-face, and I think Putin's willing to make concessions if he gets sanctions relief. And he wants to do that, and Trump is actually a negotiating partner that could happen. And so I think that's going to be the main substance here, that Putin will some sort of ceasefire, and in return he wants to see sanctions relief. He wants to see his security concerns with Ukraine.
When you talk about concessions from Russia, what could those concessions possibly look like?
Well, the concessions from Russia, to stop the bombardment, and then the Kremlin indicated in November that there was some wiggle room over where you draw the borders of the occupied territories. In the meantime, the Kremlin's line on that has hardened. It's demanding all 5 of the occupied territories, including Crimea, that the West recognize sovereignty. But the previous stance was that de jure recognition of Crimea, but de facto recognition of the other 4 regions. And also in the original 2022 agreement struck in Istanbul, that the Kremlin was actually willing to even push the question of sovereignty over Crimea 50 years down the road to future generations. So those are the kind of things, but none of it's pretty, and all of it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to swallow in particular. Zelensky's drawn a red line. He refuses in any way, shape, or form to recognize Russian sovereignty over any of the regions. So that's going to be a tough one. But Zelensky's not going to be invited to this meeting, nor are the European partners. And so there's every possibility that Putin and Trump will come to some agreement and then try and push it on particularly Ukraine, get the Europeans to follow through.
Certainly will be an interesting meeting sometime next week. Ben Aris, good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much.